आज ही डाउटनेट ऐप डाउनलोड करें। डाउटनेट पर होगा अब आपके सभी मैथ्स, केमिस्ट्री, फिजिक्स और बायोलॉजी डाउट्स का सफाया। बस अपने क्वेश्चन की फोटो खींचो, उसे क्रॉप करो और तुरंत वीडियो सोल्यूशन पाओ। डाउनलोड नाउ।
Hello everyone, let's start with the question. The question says that write the three characteristic features in photoelectric effect which cannot be explained on the basis of wave theory of light but can be explained by using Einstein's equation. So now, the three characteristic features. The first one is that it could not explain the kinetic energy of emitted electrons because they were independent of intensity of incident light. Before it was thought that the intensity of the incident light increases the kinetic energy present in electron, but that was not true. So the first point will be kinetic energy of emitted electrons was independent of the intensity of incident light. So what does affect the kinetic energy of the emitted electrons? It is actually affected by the frequency of the photons. So the frequency of photons actually affects the kinetic energy of emitted electrons. So incident just affects the number of electrons being emitted. Alright, that's a major point to be remembered. The next is that it could not explain how below a certain frequency there is no photo emission. So it was found out that below a certain frequency, which we call as threshold frequency, there were no electrons being emitted. So below the threshold frequency, no electrons were emitted. And why is that? We just learned that the frequency affects the kinetic energy of the emitted electrons. So below the threshold frequency, the electrons just did not have enough kinetic energy to be observed or to be received by the receptor plates. Alright, so below a certain frequency, the electrons just could not have enough energy. Third point is that it could not explain how there is spontaneous emission of photoelectrons. So spontaneous emission of photoelectrons. Photoelectrons are electrons that were emitted because of photoelectric effect. So why could it not explain this spontaneous emission of photoelectrons? Because spontaneous emission occurs because of the intensity of light. We just learned that the kinetic energy is affected by the frequency of photons, and the intensity of the light affects the amount of electrons being emitted. So the intensity is what causes spontaneous emission of photoelectrons, and it's also almost instantaneous. So now we can conclude our answer. Therefore, their theory of light could not explain first kinetic energy of emitted electrons, because they could not explain how it was independent of the incident light. Next, it could not explain how there is no photo emission taking place below a certain threshold frequency. The absence of photo emission below a certain frequency. Next, the last point is that it could not explain how there is spontaneous emission of photoelectrons. So the third point will be spontaneous emission of photoelectrons. Thank you.
क्लास 6 से 12 से लेके नीट, IIT, JEE मेंस और एडवांस के लेवल तक 10 मिलियन से ज़्यादा स्टूडेंट्स का भरोसा। आज ही डाउनलोड करें डाउटनेट ऐप या व्हाट्सएप कीजिए अपने डाउट्स 8400 400 400 पर।